Payroll tax makes it more expensive to create jobs here. A so-called wealth tax would really, I think, discourage people from starting up companies in Washington state.
Word that Microsoft is cutting thousands of jobs across the company.
Washington state raising taxes on millionaires to 9.9%, first state income tax. There's nothing voters can do about it either. The state Supreme Court ruling that the new tax cannot be challenged by a voter referendum.
Right now, one of America's greatest success stories is sounding the alarm. Seattle's business climate is in serious crisis, and the damage could last decades. Picture this, it's 1,975. Two college kids rent a garage in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and start writing code for a tiny computer nobody's ever heard of. 50 years later, that little garage operation has become Microsoft, one of the most valuable companies on the face of the earth, headquartered just outside Seattle in Redmond, Washington. For half a century, Microsoft has been the backbone of that region's economy. It's paid for schools, it's paid for roads, it's paid the mortgages of tens of thousands of families in the Pacific Northwest. So when the president of that company stands up and says he's worried, you'd think people would listen. Brad Smith has been with Microsoft for over 30 years. He's not some outside critic. He's not a pundit. He is, quite literally, the second most senior person at one of America's largest employers. And recently, he said something that should have made front page news everywhere. He said he's more worried about the business climate in Washington state right now than at any point in the last 3 decades. Not during the dot-com crash. Not during the 2008 financial crisis.
The elephant in every room these days is the 3-letter word that starts with T and ends with X and is called tax.
Smith didn't describe some sudden collapse. He compared it to something slower and, frankly, scarier air leaking out of a balloon rather than the balloon popping. A slow deflation that nobody quite notices until the balloon's lying flat on the floor. And how did Seattle's new mayor respond to that kind of warning from the head of the city's oldest and largest employer? With a shrug, with one word: bye. If the company that built this region for 50 years is sounding the alarm, why does the person running the city seem so unbothered? That's what we're digging into today. Now, here's why this isn't just a Seattle story or a Microsoft story. This is a pattern. We've watched it happen before in other states, under other governors, with other companies. A city or a state decides the wealthy and the successful are an endless well of money to tax. The businesses start quietly making other plans, and by the time anyone admits there's a problem, the tax base has already started walking out the door. This channel follows that money past the press releases straight to the numbers. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe and like right now. One question for the comments. If your town's oldest, biggest employer warned about the next 30 years, would you want your mayor laughing it off? Let's get into it. Katie Wilson is Seattle's new mayor, sworn in this past January. She describes herself in her own words as a democratic socialist. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. She didn't win in a landslide. She beat the previous mayor, Bruce Harrell, by just 0.7 of 1 percentage point, 50.2% to 49.5%. That made it the closest mayoral race in Seattle in over 100 years, going all the way back to 1906. Think about what that actually means. This wasn't a city uniting behind a bold new direction. This was a city split almost exactly down the middle. Half of Seattle voted for the continuation of a more business-friendly approach. The other half voted for change. And the change side won by a margin smaller than a rounding error. That matters, because when business leaders raise concerns about people and companies leaving, and the mayor's response is essentially, we're not too worried, and if they want to go, bye. She's speaking as though she has an overwhelming mandate. She doesn't. She's governing a city that's split right down the middle while talking like she's got the other half's blessing, too. To understand what changed, you have to understand who came before her. Bruce Harrell was Seattle's mayor from 2022 to the end of 2025, a moderate Democrat, generally seen as friendlier to the business community than the city council around him. Under Harrell, the city saw real, measurable improvements that mattered to everyday residents. Crime numbers came down. The police department added officers after years of losing them. Visible drug use on the streets declined from its peak. Tent encampments that had taken over public parks for years got cleared out. Now, here's the part that might surprise you. Harrell wasn't some tax-cutting conservative. He inherited the exact same budget headaches Wilson has, now a city that built its budget around taxing its biggest employers and a downtown that was hemorrhaging office tenants. Harrell even floated using the city's signature business tax known as Jumpstart to help patch general budget holes, the same idea Wilson has leaned on too. So let's be fair here. This fiscal mess isn't something Katie Wilson invented out of thin air. It predates her. But here's where the two of them really part ways. Back in 2025, there was a ballot fight over how to fund affordable housing. One option, Proposition 1A, would have leaned more heavily on new business taxes. The alternative, Proposition 1B, took a different funding approach. Harrell came out against the heavier business tax version. He was, at least on that question, trying to avoid piling more weight onto employers who were already grumbling about leaving. Katie Wilson, on the other hand, wasn't just supportive of that approach. She'd spent years before she ever ran for mayor helping build the case for taxing big employers in the first place, going back to her work as an activist pushing for Jumpstart itself. So here's the real difference, and it's worth sitting with. Two mayors inheriting the exact same budget math, the exact same hole to fill, but one of them spent his term trying to keep big employers from walking out the door, and the other one seems willing to watch them go. Let's be precise about that headline, because precision matters. Loses it doesn't mean Katie Wilson threw a fit or lost her temper on camera. What it means is this. When the largest, oldest, most consequential employer in your entire region tells you they're more worried about your city's business climate than they've been in 30 years, and your public response amounts to a shrug and bye, that's not confidence. That's a disconnect from the reality on the ground. You can call it tone deaf. You can call it ideological. What you can't call it is a serious answer to a serious warning. Forget the rhetoric for a second. Let's just look at the numbers, because the numbers don't have a political party. Washington State's new income tax adds 9.9% on every dollar earned above $1 million a year. Stack that on top of the state's existing capital gains tax and Seattle's payroll taxes on big employers, and someone running a company headquartered in Seattle proper can be looking at an effective combined burden pushing up toward 18%. Compare that to Texas, Florida, or Nevada, all of which charge zero state income tax. If you're a business owner deciding where to put your next office or your next 1,000 jobs, that's not a small detail. That's the whole spreadsheet. Seattle's own city forecasters expect to collect about $385 million from its signature payroll tax on big employers in 2026, and that's actually down compared to 2025, the first time collections have dropped since the tax began. Meanwhile, downtown Seattle's office vacancy rate has climbed from roughly 6% back in 2019 to around 32% today. Picture that for a second. Nearly 1 in 3 downtown office floors sitting empty. A recent report from the Downtown Seattle Association found the city has lost about 30,000 downtown jobs since 2020, and the taxable value of its office buildings has fallen by nearly half. Meanwhile, neighboring Bellevue, which doesn't have a comparable payroll tax, actually gained jobs and saw its commercial property values go up over that same stretch. This is the part that should worry every Seattle resident. because it's not speculation. It's already happening. Microsoft has been steadily growing its footprint north of the border in Vancouver, Canada, building out office space and adding hundreds of jobs there over the past several years. On top of a $19 billion investment, the company just committed to its broader Canadian operations through 2027. That's not a threat. That's a company already moving, with real buildings and real paychecks, to a place with a fundamentally different cost structure. Here's the bottom line on the math. This isn't a prediction anymore. A 50-year-old company is voting with its feet, one office lease at a time. If you want a single concrete example of what the business climate is deteriorating actually looks like in real life, look no further than Microsoft's own Build conference, the company's flagship event for software developers, the kind of event that fills hotel rooms and restaurants for an entire week. Microsoft pulled Build out of Seattle. Not paused, it canceled its future bookings at the Seattle Convention Center entirely. Internal communications cited attendees' experiences simply walking from their hotel to the venue, unclean streets, visible open drug use, and homeless encampments, including one tent that kept reappearing in the same tunnel near the convention center despite repeated complaints. Now, to be fair to the current mayor, this decision actually happened in mid-2025. Under the previous administration, before Katie Wilson ever took office. The city's tourism agency tried to wave it off as just a shift in post-pandemic event strategy. But that explanation doesn't hold up well against an internal memo describing in plain language what convention guests were actually seeing on the sidewalk. Here's why this matters for where we are right now. That decision proves the warning lights were already flashing before Wilson took office. Brad Smith's 3-0-year warning didn't come out of nowhere. It came after years of exactly this kind of signal, and so far, the new administration's public response has been to downplay it rather than to demonstrate it's been fixed. Here's where this stops being an abstract policy fight and starts touching real lives, including, very possibly, yours. Think about the people who actually keep these office buildings running, the custodial crews who clean those towers overnight. The small coffee shop near the Redmond campus, that depends on a steady stream of badge-swiping employees buying a latte every morning. The dry cleaner that's been pressing shirts for office workers for 20 years. When a company quietly shifts 1,000 jobs to Vancouver or Austin, none of those workers get a press release. They just notice, slowly, that there are fewer customers walking through the door. And if you're 65 or older, this can hit closer to home than you might think. Maybe your pension fund holds shares in companies tied to the Seattle tech economy. Maybe you've got a small rental property near the tech corridor that depends on young professionals needing a place to live. Maybe your own retirement health care coverage traces back, one way or another, to a regional employer that's been steadily good for decades until it isn't. Here's how the spiral works, step by step, because it really is this simple. The city raises taxes to cover a budget gap. Some businesses and high earners leave to avoid those taxes. That shrinks the tax base. A shrunken tax base means the same budget gap reopens, except now there are fewer people left to pay for it. So taxes go up again, and more people leave. Remember that $385 million payroll tax figure, down for the first time since the tax existed? That's not the bottom of this story. That's the very beginning of it. There's a real-world experiment happening right now, and you don't have to squint to see the results. It's called Bellevue, Washington, a city just a 20-minute drive from downtown Seattle. Bellevue doesn't have Seattle's payroll tax on big employers. It doesn't have the same maze of business taxes piled on top of each other. And while downtown Seattle has been losing jobs and watching office buildings sit empty, Bellevue has been adding jobs and watching its commercial property values climb. Amazon, for instance, has been steadily building up a major presence there for years, tens of thousands of employees, essentially a second headquarters, just down the highway from the city it was born in. And it's not just Bellevue. Microsoft's expansion into Vancouver. Canada shows that companies aren't just shifting jobs to the next suburb. They're willing to cross an international border entirely if the math works out better on the other side. Here's a question worth sitting with. When a company can move jobs just by driving across a city line or a national one, is Olympia betting that voters simply won't notice until it's too late? Let's go back to where we started. A garage in 1975. Two guys writing code for a computer nobody had heard of yet. 50 years and one of the most valuable companies on earth later. And the man who spent over 3 decades inside that company is comparing his home state's business climate to a balloon slowly losing air. On one side of this story, you have a three-year company, veteran, sober, and specific, warning that he's more concerned right now than he's been in 3 decades. On the other side, you have a mayor who won her office by less than 1 point, governing a city split evenly down the middle, responding to that same warning with a shrug and a single word, bye. And somewhere in between those two reactions sits a predecessor who inherited the exact same budget mess and at least tried to keep the city's biggest taxpayers from walking out the door rather than waving as they left. Here's the honest truth. This story isn't finished. The numbers we covered today, the tax revenue, the office vacancy rate, the job counts, those are going to keep updating in the months and years ahead, and not necessarily in a direction anyone in Seattle's City Hall wants to talk about. So here's what I want from you. Look around your own town. Has that little coffee shop you've gone to for years closed its doors this past year? Has the dry cleaner, the diner, the hardware store down the street shut down quietly with no explanation? Tell me in the comments, because these small local signs are often the earliest and most honest warning signs of exactly the pattern we just walked through. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that actually affect your life and your wallet. And ring that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Stay informed, stay sharp, and never stop following the money. I'll see you in the next one.